Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American West. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1887. While most historical accounts of Robert Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, focus on his exploits as the charismatic leader of the Wild Bunch, few have uncovered what transpired during the winter of 1887 in the remote valleys of southern Utah. What you're about to hear has been systematically removed from official accounts, redacted from public records, and deliberately omitted from history books. It was in December of that year when the first disappearances were recorded in the small settlement of Circleville, Utah. Located in the Sevier River Valley, approximately 165 miles south of Salt Lake City, Circleville was a modest Mormon community established in 1864. The Parker family had settled there when Robert was just a boy. By 1887, Robert was 21 years old and had already begun his descent into what would become one of the most notorious criminal careers in the American West. The winter of 1887 was particularly harsh in southern Utah. Snow drifts reportedly reached the second-story windows of some homes, and temperatures remained well below freezing for weeks at a time. Isolation was a natural condition of frontier life, but that winter, the isolation became something far more sinister. According to documents discovered in 1965 during renovations of the Butte County Courthouse, Sheriff James Wattis noted in his personal journal that between December 1887 and February 1888, 7 individuals vanished without explanation from Circleville and the surrounding homesteads. The journal, which was immediately archived following its discovery and has since been reported lost during a transfer to the State Historical Society, contained entries that paint a disturbing picture of what may have been the earliest activities of what locals had begun calling the Cassidy clan. The first to disappear was Jonathan Morley, a 52-year-old blacksmith who had reportedly had a heated disagreement with Robert Parker over payment for shoeing his horse. Morley was last seen leaving his shop on December 12th. His wife reported that he never returned home for supper. A brief search was conducted, but the assumption was that he had become disoriented in a sudden snowstorm and perished from exposure. His body was never recovered. 3 days later, Eliza Morley, Jonathan's 19-year-old daughter, also vanished. She had gone to collect eggs from their hen house early in the morning. When she didn't return, her mother found only a single dropped egg in the fresh snow and footprints leading away from the property toward the tree line. The footprints were accompanied by a second set, described in Sheriff Wattis's journal as unusually large, made by a man's boot. In a previously overlooked entry from Sheriff Wattis's journal dated December 16, 1887, he writes, "Mrs. Morley claims to have heard a scream just after dawn, but the sound was brief and might have been the wind. I examined the tracks myself. The girl's footprints showed no signs of dragging or struggle until they reached the tree line. There, the snow was disturbed in a manner suggesting she had fallen or been forced to the ground. Most concerning was the discovery of a torn piece of fabric matching the description of the shawl she had been wearing, wrapped around a low branch as if placed there deliberately. When I attempted to remove it as evidence, Mrs. Morley became hysterical, claiming it was marked in some way I could not discern. She insisted it be left where it was. Against my better judgment, I complied. By Christmas of 1887, the Morley case had become the quiet concern of the small community, but it wasn't spoken of openly. The Parker family, despite Robert's growing reputation for minor thefts and troublemaking, was well respected. Robert's father, Maximilian Parker, was a stern but fair man who had served as a town elder. No one dared suggest that Robert might be involved in anything as serious as the disappearance of their neighbors. The Circleville town records, kept by clerk Thomas Blackett, note an unusual incident during the Christmas service at the local church. According to Blackett's meticulous documentation, Robert Parker and 4 companions entered the church late, taking seats at the back. Their presence caused a noticeable discomfort among the congregation. Blackett wrote, "The young men appeared to have come directly from riding, their clothes still bearing the dust of the trail despite the snow. Most curious was their demeanor, neither reverent nor disrespectful, but watchful, their eyes moving from person to person as if searching for someone specific." Mrs. Morley, upon noticing their arrival, left the service immediately. Several others followed shortly after. The minister's sermon, which had been focused on the theme of forgiveness, shifted abruptly to a discussion of judgment and divine retribution. The true nature of what happened during those winter months remained buried until 1934, when an elderly Thomas Harrington provided a written testimony to a field researcher from the Federal Writers Project. Harrington, who had been 16 years old in 1887, claimed to have witnessed something that had haunted him for nearly 5 decades. According to Harrington's account, which was initially collected as part of oral histories of frontier life, but was subsequently removed from the official collection, he had been hunting rabbits in the foothills west of town when he observed Robert Parker and 4 other young men leading a bound figure through the snow toward an abandoned mining shaft. Harrington claimed he hid behind a fallen pine and watched as the group disappeared into the mine entrance. He reported hearing terrible sounds that he couldn't bring himself to describe even 47 years later. In a section of Harrington's testimony that was redacted from even the unofficial copies, but was referenced in a letter from the field researcher to his supervisor, Harrington allegedly described seeing the group emerge from the mine several hours later. They were carrying what appeared to be small bundles wrapped in cloth. The field researcher wrote, "Harrington's description of these bundles is so disturbing that I cannot in good conscience include it in the official record. He seems convinced that they contained personal items taken from the victim, though he admits he could not see clearly from his hiding place. His certainty is based on what he observed next. The men arranged the bundles in a circle on the snow and stood around them, heads bowed, while Parker spoke words Harrington could not hear. Harrington described it as not like any prayer I ever heard in church, but something older and colder. After this ritual, the bundles were collected and the group departed." Harrington's testimony included the names of the other young men, all of whom would later become known associates of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, Elsie Lay, Matt Warner, Tom McCarty, and a 5th man Harrington identified only as the quiet one with the scarred face. Based on later historical records, this was likely Harvey Logan, also known as Kid Curry, though he would have been only 20 years old at the time. A genealogical researcher working in the 1950s discovered that Harvey Logan's family had a history intertwined with the Parker family dating back to their time in Pennsylvania, before either family moved west. According to church records from Meadville, Pennsylvania, Logan's grandmother and Parker's grandfather had been involved in an unspecified community dispute that resulted in both families being asked to leave the congregation. The details of this dispute were never recorded, but coincided with a series of unexplained livestock deaths and property fires in the area. Harrington never reported what he saw. In his testimony, he explained, "My pa worked for Max Parker. If I'd said a word, we'd have lost everything. And besides, those boys, they weren't just thieves. There was something wrong with them, something in their eyes when they'd come into town, like they knew things about you, things no one should know." The winter wore on, and by February, 7 people had vanished. After Morley and his daughter, there was Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who operated the general store, Sarah Johansson, a midwife who lived alone on the edge of town, the Cutler brothers, William and James, who owned a small silver claim in the hills, and finally Sheriff Wattis himself. Muller's disappearance occurred on January 3, 1888, following what witness accounts described as a disagreement with Robert Parker over credit extended to the Parker family. Muller had reportedly refused to provide further goods without payment of existing debts. A German-language journal found among Muller's possessions years later, discovered during the settlement of his estate in 1915, contained entries suggesting he had become increasingly concerned about the Parker family and their associates. In an entry dated December 29, 1887, Muller wrote, translated from German, "Young Parker came again today. He did not speak, merely stood at the counter watching me. When I asked his business, he pointed to the ledger where I record debts. I showed him the considerable sum his family owes. He smiled in a way that made my blood cold and said, 'Some debts are paid differently.' I find myself checking the locks twice now. The sounds outside my window at night might be only the wind, but I no longer believe that." Sarah Johansson vanished on January 17, 1888. As the community's midwife, she kept detailed records of every birth she attended, including notes on family histories and unusual circumstances. According to testimony given in 1922 by her niece, Margaret Keller, Johansson had confided that she possessed dangerous knowledge about several prominent families in the area, including the Parkers. Keller claimed that her aunt had created a special coded ledger containing this information, which she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her cabin. After Johansson's disappearance, Keller searched for the ledger, but found only an empty space, and what appeared to be a symbol drawn in ash where the book had been. The Cutler brothers disappeared on January 25, 1888, after reporting a significant silver find at their claim in the hills west of Circleville. William Cutler had come to town the day before to register the claim officially and purchase supplies. According to the registration log at the county office, the claim was substantial enough to change the fortunes of the entire valley. Cutler was observed drinking and celebrating at the local saloon that evening, where several witnesses later reported he had a cordial conversation with Robert Parker and his associates. One witness, saloon keeper Frank Dobson, stated in a deposition given in 1913 that Parker had offered to escort the inebriated Cutler home, as his brother James was expecting him at their cabin near the claim site. Both brothers were reported missing 2 days later, when neither appeared in town for their weekly supply run. The disappearance of Sheriff Wattis on February 3, 1888, marked the end of what locals would later refer to in hushed tones as the Winter of Silence. His horse returned to town without him, saddlebags still containing official correspondence, and his lunch pail. A search party found only his badge, half buried in the snow near the same abandoned mine shaft Harrington had mentioned in his testimony. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the methodical way in which any investigation was suppressed. According to county records, a new sheriff was appointed within days, Jason Parker, Maximilian Parker's cousin. The disappearances were officially attributed to harsh winter conditions and possible animal attacks, despite the lack of bodies or evidence supporting this conclusion. A letter discovered in 1963 among the personal effects of Jason Parker's widow reveals the extent to which the investigation was deliberately misdirected. Written by Maximilian Parker to Jason shortly before his appointment as sheriff, it reads in part, "The position will soon be available to you as we discussed. When appointed, your first duty must be to close the inquiries into the recent unfortunate events. The official record should reflect the dangers of winter in this harsh country. Compensation for your assistance in this matter will be arranged through the usual channels. Remember, family stands together, no matter what storms may come." The usual channels mentioned in the letter appear to reference a complex financial arrangement uncovered by bank examiner Walter Hayes during a routine audit in 1901. Hayes documented a series of regular payments from various Parker family accounts to Jason Parker and several other local officials, beginning in February 1888 and continuing for years afterward. Hayes's audit report was filed but never acted upon. He was found dead in his hotel room in Salt Lake City 3 weeks later, an apparent suicide, though the coroner's report noted several inconsistencies, including defensive wounds on his hands and a broken window that could not be explained. By spring of 1888, Robert Parker had left Circleville, beginning the wandering that would eventually establish him as Butch Cassidy, the notorious outlaw. The families of the missing gradually moved away one by one, selling their properties for a fraction of their value to various members of the Parker extended family. Within 2 years, nearly a third of Circleville was owned by relatives of the Parkers. Records from the Circleville Township meetings, preserved in microfilm at the Utah State Archives, show a curious pattern of land transfers during this period. Properties belonging to the families of the disappeared were sold at prices far below market value, often with documentation bearing signatures that, according to later analysis, showed significant inconsistencies with known samples. The buyers, in almost every case, had direct connections to the Parker family, cousins, in-laws, and business associates. A ledger from the Circleville Bank, partially destroyed in a fire in 1899 but partially recovered and preserved by a bank clerk named Walter Sampson, contains entries indicating substantial deposits made by Maximilian Parker in the months following the disappearances. According to Sampson's sworn affidavit, given in 1922 when he was in his final days suffering from consumption, the amounts far exceeded what a struggling rancher like Parker could have legitimately earned. He came in with cash, Sampson's affidavit reads, not just a little, but bundles of it. When I asked its source, as was my duty, he looked at me in such a way that I never asked again. There was something in his eyes, something I'd seen in young Robert's eyes, too. Something that said questions weren't welcome and wouldn't be forgotten. Sampson's affidavit was filed with the Butte County Clerk, but disappeared from the records sometime before 1930. The only copy was discovered among the personal effects of Judge William Blackburn after his suicide in 1935. The circumstances of Blackburn's death, a gunshot wound to the head while seated at his desk, were ruled a suicide despite several inconsistencies noted by the coroner, including the position of the weapon and the angle of the wound. In the margins of Sampson's affidavit, Judge Blackburn had written a note. This connects to the mineshaft incidents. Parker family purchasing silence. Evidence suggests ritualistic elements to disappearances. Similar cases noted in Hanksville, 1889, Moab, 1891, Green River, 1892, pattern emerging. Will compile full report. No such report was ever found among Blackburn's papers. During the settlement of Blackburn's estate, a locked strongbox was discovered hidden in a false wall of his home office. According to court records, the box contained a collection of unusual items: a silver pocket watch with the initials J.M., likely belonging to Jonathan Morley, a woman's hair comb with several strands of red hair still attached, consistent with descriptions of Eliza Morley, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles similar to those worn by Heinrich Müller, a silver thimble, possibly belonging to Sarah Johansson, a silver claim deed with the Cutler brothers' names partially visible, and a sheriff's badge with Wattis's name engraved on the back. Also in the box was a hand-drawn map of the area around Circleville, with the location of the abandoned mine shaft marked with a symbol similar to the one reportedly found where Sarah Johansson's ledger had been. Most disturbing was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with what appeared to be observer's notes on the disappearances, written in Blackburn's hand. The journal was removed from the estate inventory by order of the presiding judge, and its whereabouts remain unknown. The court clerk who processed the inventory, Harold Jenkins, later claimed in a private letter to his sister that the journal contained accounts so disturbing that they would destroy not only the Parker family's reputation, but the very foundations of law and order in the territory, if they were ever made public. In 1956, Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a historian researching frontier justice systems, attempted to piece together the events of that winter. Her research notes, preserved in the University of Utah Special Collections but restricted from public access until 1967, detail her growing concerns about what she termed a systematic cover-up spanning generations. Simmons noted that land deeds, birth and death records, and even census information for Circleville during this period contained unusual inconsistencies. Names appeared to have been altered, dates changed, and in some cases, entire pages were missing from otherwise meticulously kept county ledgers. Most disturbing was Simmons' discovery of a leather-bound journal in the possession of Martha Wattis, the sheriff's granddaughter. The journal, which Simmons was allowed to examine but not copy, allegedly contained detailed descriptions of items recovered from the abandoned mine shaft in 1902, when the entrance collapsed during a spring thaw. According to Simmons' notes, the journal entry dated April 15, 1902, listed 7 skulls, numerous bones, some with unusual markings consistent with a knife or similar implement, a collection of personal effects, including J. Morley's pocket watch, identified by inscription, E. Morley's hair comb, H. Miller's spectacles, S. Johansson's silver thimble, the Cutler brothers' claim deed, and J. Wattis's wedding band. The entry also noted that these items were quietly buried in the Circleville Cemetery under a marker reading only winter 1887 to 1888, and that certain parties with continuing interests in the matter had paid a substantial sum to ensure that no further investigation would occur. Simmons managed to locate this unmarked grave in the Circleville Cemetery during her research. According to her notes, it was situated in the northeast corner away from the other plots, in an area typically reserved for those who died by suicide or were otherwise denied traditional burial. The grave itself was unusual, a simple stone slab with only the date 1887-1888 carved into it, no names or other information. Simmons observed that while other graves in the cemetery showed signs of regular maintenance and occasional visitation, this grave appeared deliberately neglected, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by a gnarled juniper tree that locals claimed had never been planted, but had simply appeared sometime in the early 1900s. More telling was what Simmons discovered when she attempted to examine burial records for the grave. The cemetery registry for that period contained a single page where the entry should have been, but this page had been carefully cut out with a razor. When Simmons questioned the elderly caretaker about this, he reportedly became agitated and asked her to leave, saying only, "Some graves are best left untended, some names are best left unspoken." Dr. Simmons's research came to an abrupt end in March of 1957, when her university funding was unexpectedly terminated. Her subsequent attempts to publish her findings were blocked by what she described in personal correspondence as powerful interests with surprising reach. She died in a house fire in 1959, along with all of her research materials. The official cause was listed as faulty wiring. A former colleague of Simmons, Professor Richard Evanston, attempted to continue her work after her death. In notes from his preliminary investigation, he wrote, "Eleanor was onto something significant. The pattern of suppression surrounding these events suggests an organized effort spanning multiple generations and extending far beyond a simple family cover-up. The financial records I've managed to trace show connections between the Parker family and several prominent banking and railroad interests in the years following 1888. The question is not just what happened in that mine shaft, but who benefited from ensuring it remained hidden, and how those benefits continue to shape our understanding of Western history to this day." Evanston's investigation ended abruptly when he suffered a debilitating stroke in 1960, leaving him unable to speak or write. His family reported that in the weeks leading up to his stroke, he had received several anonymous letters and had expressed concern about being followed. All of his research materials disappeared from his university office the night he was hospitalized in what was officially recorded as a routine burglary, though nothing else of value was taken. Martha Wattis died in 1960. The journal was not found among her possessions. A letter from Dr. Simmons to her colleague, Professor James Whittaker at Yale University, dated February 1959, just weeks before her death, suggests she had uncovered a broader pattern of influence. The letter, which Whittaker kept private until his own death in 1968, contained the following passage: "What began as an investigation into frontier justice has led me to a web of connections I scarcely could have imagined. The Parker family's influence extends not merely to local law enforcement and property records, but to state politics, judicial appointments, and even certain federal offices. I have traced financial contributions, marriages, and business partnerships that create a network spanning from southern Utah to Denver, San Francisco, and even Washington, D.C. The implications are staggering that a criminal enterprise could so thoroughly embed itself in the very institutions designed to curtail such activity. Most disturbing is the evidence suggesting that this network continues to operate decades after Cassidy's supposed death in Bolivia. The name has changed, but the methods remain. Whitaker's personal journal, now in the collection of his granddaughter, historian Rebecca Whitaker Chen, contains an entry from the day he received news of Simmons' death. Eleanor is gone, the fire too convenient to complete. Her work destroyed. I am now certain that what she discovered was not merely historical in nature, but represents a continuing threat. I will say no more on this matter, nor pursue it further. Eleanor's fate speaks loudly enough. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just the apparent murders themselves, but the multi-generational effort to conceal them. The power of the Parker family and their associates extended far beyond the small confines of Circleville, suggesting connections to political and economic forces that had vested interests in maintaining the heroic outlaw narrative that would eventually surround Butch Cassidy. In 1964, construction workers expanding Highway 89 near the location of the old mine shaft uncovered human remains. According to a brief mention in the Butte County Gazette, dated June 12, 1964, the bones showed unusual characteristics that prompted the county coroner to request assistance from forensic specialists. 3 days later, the same newspaper reported that the remains had been identified as likely those of Native American origin, dating back several centuries. They were reburied without further examination. A former deputy state medical examiner, speaking on condition of anonymity to a graduate student in 1968, claimed that he had briefly examined photographs of the remains before they were reburied. He stated that the bones showed evidence of systematic and precise trauma, inconsistent with either accidental death or traditional Native American burial practices. He further noted that the remains appeared to include those of at least 6 individuals, one of whom had a silver filling in a molar, a dental procedure that would have been unavailable to indigenous peoples of the pre-colonial era. The cuts on the bones weren't random, the examiner is quoted as saying. They followed a pattern, almost like ritual markings. Some appeared to have been made while the victims were still alive, based on evidence of healing around certain marks. Others were clearly post-mortem. Most disturbing were the skull fractures. Each skull had been broken in precisely the same location, the left temporal region, with what appeared to be a single, controlled blow from an instrument like a hammer or the blunt end of an axe. This wasn't murder in the heat of passion. This was methodical. The examiner also described finding trace evidence of a substance in the soil surrounding the remains that laboratory tests identified as a mixture of human blood, mercury, and an unidentified organic compound. When he attempted to pursue further testing, the samples were confiscated by officials claiming to represent the State Archaeological Office. No record of these samples appears in any state archives. The graduate student's thesis, which included this testimony, was never published. According to university records, it was withdrawn due to methodological concerns. The student, Michael Cranston, disappeared shortly after withdrawing his thesis. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop near the Nevada border with no signs of foul play. The case remains officially unsolved. His family reported receiving a single postcard from him months later, postmarked from Buenos Aires, Argentina, stating only, "Some histories are better left unwritten. I won't be coming home." Handwriting experts later questioned the authenticity of this message. What happened in Circleville during that winter of 1887-1888 represents more than just a series of frontier murders. It appears to mark the beginning of what would become a pattern of behavior for the group that would eventually be known as the Wild Bunch. While history remembers them primarily as bank and train robbers who prided themselves on never killing during their heists, the evidence suggests a darker reality. Between 1888 and 1897, when the Wild Bunch began their more documented criminal activities, at least 23 other disappearances across Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah share striking similarities with the Circleville incidents. In each case, the victims had some connection, however minor, with Butch Cassidy or his known associates. In each case, investigations were perfunctory at best, often led by local authorities with familial or financial ties to the Parker extended network. And in each case, surviving records show evidence of alteration or selective redaction. One particularly disturbing case occurred in Hanksville, Utah, in the summer of 1889. According to local newspaper accounts, a surveyor named Edward Moreland vanished while mapping terrain near the Dirty Devil River. Moreland had been contracted by a Denver-based mining company to assess potential silver deposits in the region. His last known communication was a letter to his employers stating he had encountered unexpected opposition from local interests and mentioning specifically a confrontation with a young man claiming to represent the Parker family holdings. 3 days after sending this letter, Moreland disappeared. His survey equipment was found neatly arranged beside his campsite, as if he had stepped away momentarily intending to return. His field journals, which would have contained his observations and maps, were missing. A search party organized by the local sheriff found only a set of footprints leading from the campsite to the river's edge, where they abruptly ended. The sheriff's report concluded that Moreland had likely fallen into the river and drowned, though no body was ever recovered. What the official report failed to mention, but was later revealed in a letter from one of the search party members to his brother, was the discovery of a strange arrangement of stones near the footprints. 7 stones placed in a circle, with a central stone bearing markings similar to those later found at other sites connected to the Cassidy clan. A curious pattern emerges when these disappearances are mapped geographically and chronologically. They create a rough outline of the movements of Cassidy and his associates during this 9-year period, suggesting that their more famous robberies may have been secondary to other, more disturbing activities. Dr. Calvin Hutchins, a criminologist who attempted to map this pattern in a 1966 study, found that the disappearances occurred in clusters, usually preceding major robberies attributed to the Wild Bunch by 1 to 2 weeks. His analysis suggested that these weren't random crimes of opportunity, but calculated acts that served some purpose in the gang's broader criminal enterprise. Hutchins presented his preliminary findings at a criminology conference in Denver in May 1966. His paper, titled Patterns of Disappearance, Reconsidering the Criminal Methodology of the Wild Bunch, was withdrawn from publication following the conference. Hutchins accepted a position at a university in Australia 3 months later and discontinued his research on the topic. Before leaving the United States, however, Hutchins confided in a colleague, Dr. Margaret Sloan, sharing his concerns about pressure he had received to abandon his research. According to Sloan's notes from their conversation, Hutchins had been approached by a man claiming to represent the Utah Historical Society who had offered him a substantial grant to pursue more productive avenues of research. When Hutchins declined, he began receiving anonymous letters containing personal information about his wife and children, including details of their daily routines that could only have been obtained through surveillance. The last straw, Sloan wrote in her private journal, was finding a small cloth bundle on their doorstep containing a lock of his daughter's hair that had been cut while she slept, without anyone in the household being aware of an intruder. Attached was a note reading simply, "Some patterns are best left unmapped." Calvin showed me the bundle. The hair was tied with a thin strip of rawhide and wrapped in a square of fabric that appeared to be cut from an old garment. Most disturbing was the symbol drawn on the fabric in what looked like dried blood, a circular design with radiating lines that Calvin said matched symbols found at several sites connected to the disappearances he was studying. Perhaps most chilling is the testimony of James LaFleur, a former member of the Wild Bunch, who was captured after a failed bank robbery in Telluride in 1889. LaFleur, facing hanging, offered information in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to court transcripts that were sealed until 1965, LaFleur described rituals conducted before major robberies, involving tokens taken from those who had crossed them. Before every job, LaFleur is recorded as saying, Cassidy would gather us in a circle. He'd lay out items taken from them that had disappeared, a watch, a ring, a lock of hair. We'd each touch the items while he recited something, sounded like a verse, but not from any Bible I know. Said it gave us power over those who might try to stop us. Said it made us invisible to the law. I didn't believe in such things, but the others did, especially the kid, likely referring to Kid Curry. He'd get a look in his eye during those times, like he wasn't all there. When pressed by the judge to provide more details about who those who had disappeared were, LaFleur reportedly became agitated, saying, I've said too much already. They'll know. Somehow, they always know. Even in here, they'll find out. LaFleur was found hanged in his cell the night before he was to provide details to a federal marshal. His death was ruled a suicide, a detail not included in the official court transcript, but noted in the private journal of the court stenographer, describes LaFleur's final moments in the courtroom. As the prisoner was being led away, he suddenly turned back, his face ashen. He lunged toward the judge, not in attack but in desperation, as if seeking protection. They're here, he said, looking toward the back of the courtroom. He's here. When the judge asked who he meant, LaFleur pointed to an empty corner of the room and said, Parker, standing right there, watching, always watching. There was, of course, no one there, though I confess a chill passed through me at his words and the absolute conviction with which he spoke them. The stenographer's journal, discovered among family papers in 1972, also contains a curious addendum. Found scratched into the wall of LaFleur's cell after his death, they take more than your life. Below these words was a crude drawing of what appeared to be a mine shaft entrance. The abandoned mine shaft near Circleville collapsed completely following heavy rains in 1912. By then, the story of what had happened there had faded into local legend, spoken of only in whispers, if at all. The Parker family's influence ensured that more palatable narratives about Butch Cassidy prevailed. One aspect of the Cassidy legend that has received little scrutiny is the claim that he and his partner, the Sundance Kid, died in a shootout with Bolivian troops in 1908. This narrative, based largely on unreliable secondhand accounts, has been challenged by numerous historians. Some evidence suggests that Cassidy returned to the United States and lived under an assumed identity for many years. A report filed by Pinkerton detective Frank Chapman in 1925, discovered in the agency's archives in 1970, describes an encounter with a man Chapman believed to be Cassidy in a small town in Oregon. Chapman wrote, "The subject matches Cassidy's description in all particulars, though aged appropriately for the intervening years. When approached and addressed by the name Parker, he showed no surprise, merely a wariness. He invited me to join him for coffee, during which he made several references to events only Cassidy could have known. When I inquired directly as to his identity, he smiled and said, 'That man died in South America, as you well know.' Upon leaving, he placed his hand on my shoulder and said, 'Best let sleeping dogs lie, Mr. Chapman. Some stories aren't meant to have proper endings.'" Chapman requested reassignment the following day and never pursued the Cassidy case again. What Chapman's report fails to mention, but was revealed in his personal correspondence discovered among his effects after his death in 1947, was the reason for his sudden abandonment of the case. In a letter to his brother dated 3 days after the encounter, Chapman wrote, "I cannot explain even to myself the effect this man had on me. I have faced hardened criminals, murderers, and madmen in my career without flinching, but something in this man's gaze froze my very soul. When he touched my shoulder, I felt a coldness that lingered for hours afterward. And though he spoke of letting sleeping dogs lie, his eyes conveyed a different message entirely, that I stood at the edge of something so dark that a single step further would mean my own destruction. I am not a superstitious man, but I tell you now, I will never speak this man's name again, nor pursue him further. Some hunts are not worth the price they demand. In a journal entry dated a week later, Chapman noted, "Found a small package on my doorstep this morning. Inside was a pocket watch I recognized as belonging to Johnson, the Pinkerton man who disappeared in Wyoming in '96 while tracking the Wild Bunch. The attached was a note reading only, 'Time runs out for those who look too deeply. I have requested transfer to the Chicago office, effective immediately.'" When Hollywood immortalized Cassidy in the 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the charismatic, nonviolent outlaw portrayal cemented his place in American mythology. What remains hidden is the psychological reality of the man and his associates, the calculated terror they instilled in small communities, the methodical elimination of those who opposed them, and the network of influence that protected them long after their supposed deaths. In 1965, anthropologist Dr. Raymond Whitaker attempted to interview elderly residents of Piute County about local histories. His recorded interviews, housed in the American Folklore Collection but restricted from public access until recently, include one particularly disturbing account from 93-year-old Sarah Jenkins, who had been a child in Circleville during the winter of 1887-1888. Jenkins, speaking in a barely audible voice, recalled, "We were told never to look at them directly. Mother said if they caught you looking, they'd remember your face, and you didn't want them remembering your face. The night Sheriff Wattis disappeared, I saw them riding back into town. Their horses were different somehow, moving too quiet, and they were carrying something wrapped in canvas, something that dripped a dark trail in the snow. I closed my curtains and didn't look again. Next morning, that trail was gone, like it had never been there. But I knew what I saw." Jenkins went on to describe how, in the days following the sheriff's disappearance, she observed Robert Parker and his associates entering and leaving the Parker family home at odd hours. They'd come and go at midnight, at dawn, always carrying things, bundles, boxes. Once I saw them with a wooden chest that took 3 men to carry. They brought it in empty and took it out full. It was too heavy then, for even the 3 of them. They struggled with it. In a portion of the interview that was apparently edited from the official transcript, but referenced in Whitaker's research notes, Jenkins described a night in late February when she was awakened by what she thought was singing coming from the direction of the Parker house. "It wasn't like any singing I'd ever heard," she reportedly said. "The words weren't in any language I knew, and the voices, they didn't sound quite human, too hollow somehow, too cold. I put my pillow over my head to block it out, but it seemed to get inside me anyway. When I finally fell back asleep, I dreamed of the mine shaft. In the dream, it wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a mouth, and it was speaking those same words I'd heard in the singing." When Whitaker attempted to follow up on Jenkins' account, he discovered she had been moved to a private care facility in Salt Lake City. The facility administrators denied him access, citing her fragile mental state. She died 3 weeks later. No death certificate was ever filed, and requests for information about her burial have been met with administrative silence. Another of Whitaker's interviews with 87-year-old Frederick Garwood, a former miner who had worked claims near Circleville in the late 1880s, provided additional context for the abandoned mine where the disappearances allegedly centered. "That wasn't just any mine," Garwood stated. "It had a history even before the Parker boy and his friends took an interest in it. It was started by a fellow named Jeremiah Blackwood around 1870. He was digging for silver, but found something else. He never said what exactly, but he stopped using hired help after the first few months, started working alone, became real secretive. Then one day, he sealed up the entrance and left town. Just walked away from what everyone thought was a worthless claim." When asked what he thought Blackwood had found, Garwood became evasive. Some things are best left buried. All I know is when the Parker boy reopened that mine, things changed in Circleville. People changed, got quiet, started keeping to themselves. You'd see them in town, going about their business, but something was different, like they were just going through the motions. And their eyes. There was something missing in their eyes. Garwood's account included details that were later corroborated by land office records. Jeremiah Blackwood did indeed file a claim for the mine in 1870 and abruptly abandoned it a year later, despite initial assay reports suggesting the presence of silver. What the official records don't mention, but was found in Blackwood's personal journal, discovered in the archives of a Portland, Oregon Historical Society in 1971, is his final entry before abandoning the claim, "May God forgive me for what I've uncovered. I have sealed the entrance as best I can and will depart tomorrow. I leave this warning to any who might follow. There are depths to which men should not descend, secrets the earth keeps for good reason. What lies in that darkness should remain there undisturbed. I have seen it only once, but it sees me still in my dreams." The question remains, what actually happened in that mine shaft? The fragmentary evidence suggests something beyond simple murder. The unusual markings on the bones, the ritual collection of personal items, and the extreme measures taken to conceal these activities point to something more systematic and psychologically disturbing than the actions of typical frontier outlaws. Some researchers have suggested that Robert Parker's transformation into Butch Cassidy may have been more than just a name change to evade the law. The psychological break implied by adopting a new identity coincides with the events of that winter, suggesting a more profound transformation, perhaps a recognition that there was no going back from what had been done in that darkness. Cassidy's childhood friends, interviewed decades later as part of various historical projects, consistently described him as having been a different person after that winter. Joseph Meeks, who had attended school with Parker, told an interviewer in 1932, "Bobby Parker was a normal boy, mischievous, sure, but not mean, not cruel. But after that winter, the winter when the Morleys and the others disappeared, he was different, harder, colder, like something inside him had been hollowed out and replaced with something else. His laugh wasn't the same. It didn't reach his eyes anymore." Another childhood acquaintance, Mary Lawson, provided a similar account to a local historian in 1940. "The change in him was so sudden it frightened us all. Before that winter, he was just a boy with a bit too much spirit. After, there was something about him that made even the dogs in town grow quiet when he passed. His own dog, a hound he'd raised from a pup, wouldn't go near him anymore, just cowered and whined. Animals sense things we don't, my grandmother always said. They see what's really there, beneath the skin." The few surviving letters written by Cassidy during his later years, particularly those sent from South America, where he allegedly fled after faking his death, contain cryptic references to the winter work and debts paid in full. One letter, sent to his sister Lula Parker Bettinson in 1925, includes the phrase, "What comfort I take is in knowing that none who wronged us drew another breath to speak of it. In that, at least, we were thorough." The letter was promptly destroyed by Bettinson, according to her grandson's testimony to a historian in 1963. She allegedly told him, "Some things are best left buried with the bones." Another letter, discovered in the personal effects of Matt Warner after his death in 1938, offers perhaps the most disturbing insight into the psychological state of the Cassidy clan during this period. Written by Cassidy to Warner in 1899, shortly before the formation of the Wild Bunch, it reads in part, "I am troubled, Matt, by dreams of the shaft, of what waits there still. Sometimes I think I hear them, even now, all these years later, their voices carried on the wind, asking why, as if they didn't know, as if they hadn't pushed us to it with their judgments, their small-minded decency. What we began there can never be undone, and perhaps that's as it should be. We are what the shaft made us. Remember the oath we took, in blood and bone. Never speak of it, never return to it, and never stop. Warner apparently kept this letter hidden in a false bottom of his trunk, discovered only when the trunk was sold at auction following his widow's death. The buyer, recognizing the historical significance of the letter, turned it over to the Utah Historical Society, where it was promptly classified and restricted from public access. Its existence came to light only through a clerical error in 1967, when it was briefly listed in a catalog of the Society's holdings before being removed. A forensic analysis of the letter, conducted surreptitiously by a graduate student with access to the archives in 1968, revealed several disturbing details not apparent in the text itself. The paper showed traces of an unusual residue, which tests identified as a combination of mineral compounds consistent with those found in the soil near Circleville, specifically in the area where the mine shaft had been located. More disturbing was the discovery that the ink used contained traces of human blood, a practice occasionally found in personal correspondence of a highly emotional or significant nature during the 19th century, but usually reserved for love letters or death notifications, not ordinary communication between associates. The graduate student's findings were documented in a personal journal that was later acquired by a private collector of Western memorabilia. The collector, who has requested anonymity, allowed limited access to the journal for this investigation, noting that they had received anonymous offers to purchase it for sums far exceeding its apparent historical or financial value. The legacy of the Cassidy clan extends beyond their criminal exploits. It reaches into the very way history is recorded and preserved. The systematic removal of evidence, the intimidation of witnesses, the co-option of local authorities, and the careful cultivation of a more acceptable narrative represent a form of historical violence that continues to this day. In 1957, a small independent publisher in Salt Lake City announced plans to release a book titled The Dark Winter, Butch Cassidy's Hidden History by local historian Gerald Monroe. Before the book could be published, the publishing house suffered a devastating fire that destroyed not only the manuscript, but all the research materials Monroe had collected over a decade. Monroe himself was severely injured in the fire, suffering burns that left him unable to continue his work. The official investigation concluded that the fire was caused by faulty electrical wiring, despite the building having passed a safety inspection just 2 weeks earlier. In a brief interview given from his hospital bed, Monroe said only, "They found me. I don't know how, but they found me. The book is gone. Let it be. Let it all be." He refused to discuss his research further and died 3 months later from complications related to his injuries. What is known about Monroe's research comes primarily from correspondence with colleagues and notes shared with his editor prior to the fire. These materials, preserved by his editor's widow and made available to select researchers in the 1970s, suggest that Monroe had uncovered a pattern of influence extending from the Parker family to various financial and political institutions throughout the West. Most significantly, he had traced a series of land acquisitions following the Circleville disappearances that eventually formed the basis for several major mining and railroad developments in the early 20th century. One of Monroe's letters to a colleague at the University of Colorado states, "What began as an investigation into frontier outlaws has revealed something far more disturbing, a calculated use of terror and murder as tools for economic acquisition. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence, but strategic eliminations of obstacles to the Parker family's territorial ambitions. Most disturbing is the evidence suggesting that these ambitions weren't limited to the Parkers themselves, but were part of a broader consortium involving several supposedly respectable business interests in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco." The colleague to whom this letter was addressed, Professor William Hargrove, committed suicide 2 weeks after receiving it, leaving a note that read only, "Some truths are too heavy to bear. What happened in Circleville during the E.T. winter of 1887-1888 may never be fully known. The mine shaft is now sealed beneath tons of rock. Most physical evidence has been destroyed or lost in convenient accidents or bureaucratic transfers. Those who knew the truth firsthand have long since passed away, many under circumstances that raise more questions than they answer. What remains are the echoes, fragments of testimony, inconsistencies in official records, the suspicious patterns of power and influence that continue to protect certain narratives while suppressing others. And perhaps most tellingly, the persistent fear that still lingers in the descendants of those who lived through that winter. One such descendant is Marie Wattis Peterson, great-granddaughter of Sheriff James Wattis. Interviewed in 1998 for a local history project, she explained the curious silence that had surrounded her family's history. Growing up, we never spoke of great-grandfather. When I would ask, my grandmother would change the subject. Once, when I was about 12, I found an old badge in a drawer. When I showed it to my grandmother, she became so upset she had to take to her bed. She made me promise never to mention it again, never to ask about him. She said, "They're still watching." They're always watching. I didn't understand who they were, but I never asked again. Peterson went on to describe how, even decades later, her family maintained certain unusual habits. Never discussing family history outside the home, changing the subject when Butch Cassidy was mentioned, avoiding Circleville entirely, despite having roots there. It was like an unspoken rule, she said. We don't go there. We don't talk about it. We don't draw attention to ourselves. Most disturbing was her recollection of her grandmother's deathbed confession in 1972. She called me close and whispered, "The Parker boy and his friends, they didn't just kill your great-grandfather, they took parts of him as trophies. And not just him, all of them. They kept pieces, and they used them for something I won't speak of even now. But they're still out there, the pieces. And as long as they have them, they have power." I thought it was just the morphine talking, but the fear in her eyes, that was real. Peterson herself became increasingly reclusive in the years following the interview. Neighbors reported that she kept her curtains drawn at all times and installed multiple locks on her doors. When a local historical society attempted to follow up with her for additional information in 2003, they discovered that she had sold her home and moved without leaving a forwarding address. Her current whereabouts are unknown. In 2011, a small archaeological survey was conducted near the site of the collapsed mine as part of an environmental impact study for a proposed highway expansion. The survey was abruptly terminated when workers discovered what appeared to be a stone cairn with symbols carved into its surface. Before archaeologists could properly document the find, the cairn was destroyed in what was described as an act of vandalism. No suspects were ever identified. The project supervisor, Dr. Helen Martins, filed a complaint with the State Historical Preservation Office, arguing that the destruction appeared deliberate and professional rather than random vandalism. Her complaint was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. She subsequently accepted a position at a university in New Zealand and has declined all requests for interviews regarding the incident. One of the workers present at the site, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper reporter, described the cairn as unlike anything I've ever seen. The symbols weren't Native American, at least not any tribe from around here. They looked wrong somehow, like they hurt your eyes to look at them too long, and there was something buried underneath. We saw the edge of it when we moved one of the stones. Looked like a metal box of some kind. That's when the men in the truck showed up. They didn't identify themselves, just said the site was being shut down by order of the State Historical Society. They waited while we packed up, then stayed behind. We heard the explosion as we were driving away. Sounded like dynamite. The newspaper never ran the story. The reporter who conducted the interview, Janet Morgan, left the newspaper shortly afterward. In a private blog post that was quickly deleted but archived by a colleague, she wrote, 20 years in journalism, and I've never been told so directly not to pursue a story. No explanation, just a firm drop it from the editor. When I pressed, he showed me a letter on legal letterhead representing some historical preservation trust I'd never heard of, threatening litigation that would bankrupt the paper 10 times over. But it was his face that convinced me. He was scared. Not of lawsuits, but of something else, something he wouldn't name. I'm leaving the paper, but not the story. Some truths need to be told, no matter who wants them buried. Morgan began researching independently, focusing on land ownership records for the area around the mine shaft site. 6 weeks into her investigation, she was killed in what police described as a home invasion gone wrong. The perpetrators were never identified, and the case remains open. Her research materials were not found in her home, though her laptop and other valuables were left untouched. Local residents still speak of the Parker legacy with a curious mixture of pride and unease. Circleville maintains a small museum dedicated to its famous outlaw son, but notably, the exhibits focus exclusively on his later career as a bank robber. The winter of 1887-1888 is not mentioned. A visitor in 2017 reported asking the elderly museum docent about that period. The docent allegedly replied, "We don't talk about that winter. Never have, never will. Some stories aren't meant to be told." When depressed, the docent excused herself and closed the museum early that day. The museum itself occupies a curious place in the town's geography. Located on the main street, it sits directly across from the old Parker family home, which remains private property, owned by a trust whose beneficiaries are not publicly listed. The house has been meticulously maintained, but stands perpetually empty, its windows covered with heavy drapes. Local children reportedly avoid walking past it, especially after dark. Behind the house, barely visible from the road, stands a small stone structure that predates the house itself. According to county records, it was originally a spring house used for keeping food cool in the days before refrigeration. However, architectural historians have noted several unusual features, including the thickness of its walls, the depth of its foundation, and a curious arrangement of symbols carved into the lintel above its door, symbols that bear a striking resemblance to those reportedly found on the cairn near the mine shaft. A folklore researcher who photographed these symbols in 2005 reported that, upon developing the film, she found the images inexplicably blurred, despite all other photographs in the roll being clear. When she returned to take digital photos, she discovered that the lintel had been replaced with a new stone bearing no markings. When she inquired about this at the town hall, she was told that the structure had been renovated for preservation purposes by the historical trust that owned the property. No records of this renovation were filed with the building department. In 2015, a team from a popular paranormal investigation television show attempted to film a segment about the Parker house and the legends surrounding it. They were denied permits by the town council and reportedly received anonymous threats warning them to stay away. The episode was never produced. The producer of the show later shared in an industry podcast that the experience had been unlike any other in his career. "We've been denied access to locations before, but never with this level of, I don't know what to call it except fear." The town officials weren't angry or defensive. They were terrified. One of them took me aside and said, "For your own safety, for the safety of your crew, please leave this alone. You don't understand what you're dealing with." When I asked what he meant, he just shook his head and walked away. We decided to respect their wishes, but I still wonder what could inspire that kind of reaction more than a century after the events in question. Perhaps the final word on this disturbing chapter should go to Thomas Harrington, the young man who witnessed the Cassidy clan leading someone to the mine shaft that winter day. Near the end of his 1934 testimony, he stated, "I've carried this weight for almost 50 years. I've woken countless nights hearing those sounds from the mine. I never saw what they did down there, but I know this. What happened in Circleville wasn't robbery or ordinary murder. It was something colder, more deliberate. They enjoyed it. And the worst part is, they got away with it. Not just got away, but were celebrated for it, made into heroes. If there's a hell, they're surely there. But their legend lives on, cleaned up and made respectable. That's the real crime, that we took monsters and turned them into myths. Harrington died in his sleep the night after giving his testimony. The official cause was listed as natural causes due to advanced age. He was 63 years old. The shadow of the Cassidy clan still falls across the American West, hidden behind the more palatable myths we've chosen to remember. But in the quiet valleys of southern Utah, when winter descends and the isolation grows profound, some say you can still feel the weight of what happened there. A history too macabre to print in books, too disturbing to acknowledge, but too significant to ever truly disappear. The most troubling question isn't what happened in that mine shaft, or even why it happened. The most troubling question is how the truth could be so thoroughly suppressed for so long, across generations, suggesting a network of influence that extends far beyond what a simple outlaw gang should have been capable of creating or maintaining. As recently as 2019, researchers attempting to access certain historical records related to Circleville and the Parker family have reported unusual difficulties, files that should exist but don't, permissions suddenly revoked, and in one case, a break-in at a researcher's home in which nothing was taken except her notes on the case. The researcher, doctoral candidate Emily Winters from the University of Colorado, abandoned her dissertation on power structures and historical narrative in the American West shortly after the break-in. She has since declined all requests for interviews, citing personal reasons for her change in academic focus. What we are left with, then, is a shadow history, a collection of fragments, testimonies, and suspicious silences that outline the shape of something that has been deliberately erased. Like a photo with a figure cut out, we can see only the negative space, the absence that tells us something was there. In that negative space lies the true story of Butch Cassidy and his clan, not the romanticized outlaws of film and folklore, but something far darker, a group that instilled such terror that its effects are still felt more than a century later, a network of influence so effective that it could rewrite history itself, and a series of acts so disturbing that even those who know the truth are afraid to speak it. The winter of 1887-1888 in Circleville, Utah, remains a black hole in American history, a place where truth went in but never came out. What emerged instead was myth, carefully constructed and jealously protected even to this day. As we conclude this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American frontier history, we're left with more questions than answers, more shadows than light. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some truths are too dark to face directly. But one thing is certain, the history of Butch Cassidy and the wild bunch that appears in books, films, and museums is not the whole story. It may not even be the true story. It's the story that was allowed to survive, carefully curated by hands that have never quite let go of the power they seized in a small Utah town during a long-ago winter. And somewhere, perhaps, the real story waits, in a forgotten archive, an overlooked testimony, or a metal box buried beneath a cairn of stones, marked with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon. Until that story is brought fully into the light, the legend of Butch Cassidy remains incomplete, a sanitized myth concealing a truth too macabre to print in history books.